This is a fictional story inspired by decades of UFO folklore and witness testimony accounts. All names, dates, locations, and events are invented for dramatic purposes and do not depict real people or real events. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She was a surgical nurse stationed at Ashford Army Airfield in the summer of 1952, and for 33 years, she said nothing. Then, in 1985, in a small recorded conversation with an independent researcher in Tucson, she said that on one July morning she had photographed two beings that were not human before a group of soldiers walked in and took everything from her hands: the camera, the film, and, not long after, the two figures themselves. One nurse, two beings, 33 years of silence. Why does that silence carry more weight than almost anything she actually described? Let's start with the moment itself, not the years around it. It was the 9th of July, 1952. Early morning, before the base had properly woken up. Eleanor was pulled from her regular rounds and walked, without much explanation, to a restricted structure on the far edge of the airfield that most personnel simply called Building 9. Some records from that period label it only as auxiliary storage, with nothing else attached to the name. A senior officer she either couldn't recall or chose not to name told her that her medical training was needed. Not her hands. Not her nursing skill. Her training. A distinction she kept coming back to decades later, as if whatever waited for her required a particular kind of mind just to survive looking at it. She passed through two sets of doors. The air changed on the other side. A metallic smell, she said, like touching your tongue to a battery, and a cold that felt deliberate, engineered, the way it feels standing too long in an operating theater. And then she saw them. Two small figures resting on standard-issue gurneys. Gray. But not the gray of illness. She was careful to specify. Gray like something that had simply never once been touched by sunlight. She estimated each was a little under 4 feet in length. The heads were large, disproportionately so, with facial features so faint they barely registered at first. No visible ears, only the suggestion of a nose, eyes closed, or perhaps without lids to open at all. It was the hands she kept returning to, every single time she told this story. 4 fingers, no thumb. A texture she reached for the word waxy to describe before correcting herself. No, more like a membrane. Thin, almost see-through. If you held a light under the palm, I think you'd see something moving beneath it. She was alone with them, she says, for somewhere between 12 and 20 minutes. She was certain of the lower number because she'd checked her watch on the way in, and again the moment the soldiers arrived. She was less certain of the upper number because, in her own words, there were stretches of that room she simply could not fully account for. Not blackouts. Not lost time in the dramatic sense. Just moments that felt too far outside anything ordinary for her mind to properly file them anywhere. And during those minutes, Eleanor Voss had a camera in her hands. She hadn't brought one with her. It was already there. A Rolleiflex, sitting on a metal tray beside the nearer gurney, as though someone, at some level of whatever this operation was, had decided a visual record needed to exist. Or had already decided that, and then, for reasons she would spend the rest of her life wondering about, thought better of it. She picked it up anyway. And what she did next, 20 careful, deliberate photographs taken by a trained nurse who treated that room like any other procedure she'd ever documented, is where this story stops being a ghost story and starts being something much harder to file away. She worked the way her training told her to work. Wide shots first. Establishing frames, she called them, the same term she'd used to log any surgical case. Then closer still. She photographed the chest of the nearer figure and noted there was no visible rise or fall of breath, though she was careful, even decades later, not to call that death. I couldn't tell you if it was dead. I could only tell you it wasn't breathing the way you or I breathe. She photographed the hands at close range and noticed something she almost missed. A faint banding pattern along the underside of each finger, subtle, almost textile in appearance, like the ridged grip of a surgical tool or the underside of something built rather than born. She noticed it because that was her entire professional life. trained to look closely at the surfaces of bodies, to catch the one detail that mattered inside a room full of details that didn't. She said she wasn't afraid while she worked. She used one specific word to describe how she felt, and it's the word that researcher would return to again and again in his notes: professional. As though the discipline of her training had simply overridden whatever horror or wonder might otherwise have taken her legs out from under her. Then the doors opened. 4 soldiers walked in. One of them, calm, quiet, no raised voice, no explicit threat, asked her to set the camera down and step back. She did. The camera was taken from her hands. A man in plain civilian clothes, someone she had never seen before and would never see again, removed the film from the camera himself, right there in the room, with the kind of practiced efficiency that told her this wasn't the first time he'd done it. The 2 figures were covered. She was walked out through a different door than the one she'd entered, escorted across the tarmac back to the hospital wing, and told, simply, to continue her shift. No one asked her to sign anything that day. That detail, once you sit with it, is almost impossible to move past. Every account like this one usually ends with a document, a threat, a room with fluorescent lighting, and a pen slid across a table. Eleanor got none of that. What she got instead, over the following decades, was something quieter and, in its own way, more effective. There was an understanding, she said, in the only recorded interview she ever gave. Nobody told me not to talk. I just understood that what I'd seen wasn't something the world was ready to be handed. Consider what those 33 years contained. Consider that the very language used to explain what came down near that base changed within days, from one kind of aircraft in the first press statement to a far more ordinary explanation less than 48 hours later, a shift in language that has held ever since. Nobody keeps 33 years of silence about a weather instrument. When Eleanor finally spoke, it wasn't to a journalist. It wasn't to any program with cameras or an audience. It was to a man named Daniel Reyes, a former university archivist working, by then, mostly alone out of a converted spare room in his house in Tucson, with filing cabinets that reached the ceiling and a telephone that he later told a colleague had a habit of ringing at strange hours. He wasn't famous. He wasn't well-funded. But he was patient, and he was careful. And when Eleanor finally called him in the spring of 1985, he listened for 2 hours before he asked her a single follow-up question. Why him? Why then? That's the question that has no clean answer. And it's the same question that would eventually cost Daniel Reyes almost everything he'd spent a decade building. Eleanor's own answer, when Reyes finally did ask her directly, was quiet and specific. She said she was 61 years old. She said she had watched too many of the other people who'd been on that base that summer. Other nurses, orderlies, ground crew who'd driven trucks out toward the retrieval site, die without ever saying a word. I was tired, she told him, of the math of it, of the people who knew things dying faster than the things they knew could be said out loud. Once you sit with that sentence, it stops sounding paranoid and starts sounding like arithmetic. Here is what we can say with confidence and what we cannot. We know Eleanor described taking roughly 20 frames. We know she described the camera precisely enough that when Reyes pressed her on technical detail, aperture, film type, whether she'd used the built-in light meter, her answers matched someone who had genuinely operated that model before, which hospital equipment logs from the era later confirmed she had, since Ashford's surgical wing used Rolleiflex cameras for procedural documentation throughout the early 1950s. We do not have the photographs. We do not have the camera. There is no record of that film ever being processed. And because military photographic labs at the time tracked every roll through a strict requisition system, that absence isn't nothing. It's a hole with a shape to it. The supply logs for Ashford in the weeks following the incident show something curious. 8 rolls of 35mm film are logged as expended medical documentation in the second week of July 1952. Standard procedure required each roll to be cross-referenced against a specific case number. 7 of the 8 rolls check out cleanly. The 8th points to a case file that, when a researcher working alongside Reyes filed a formal request for it in 1989, was said to have been transferred to a federal storage facility out of state. When she followed up with that facility directly, she was told no such transfer had ever been logged on their end. A roll of film, a case number, a file that was moved, and, according to the people supposedly holding it, was never moved at all. Not suspicious on its own. Everything is explicable in isolation. But this wasn't isolation. This was accumulation. And once you start mapping it, the pattern holds together with an unsettling kind of consistency. Reyes didn't treat Eleanor's account as a single, isolated anomaly. He spent the next 3 years trying to track down anyone else who'd been stationed at Ashford's medical wing that same July. He found 3. 2 declined to speak with him at all. The third, a nursing aide whose name Reyes withheld from his notes at her own request, confirmed only that she'd been aware something unusual was happening in the restricted section of the base that week, though she said she hadn't seen anything directly. She'd simply been told by a superior officer, very plainly, to stay in the hospital wing and not go wandering. Stay in the hospital wing and not go wandering. During the same week, the base had, officially, retrieved nothing more than a weather instrument. There was a 4th person Reyes eventually located. Not medical staff, but a young supply corporal named Walter Finch, who'd worked in Ashford's equipment stores from that spring through the end of the year. Finch spoke to Reyes by telephone in 1987 and, unlike the others, agreed to be named. He said that on the 10th or 11th of July, he'd been ordered to restock a specific supply cabinet in a wing of the base he'd never before had clearance to enter. The cabinet, he said, hadn't simply run low through normal use. It had been emptied, deliberately, the way things are emptied when someone is collecting them on purpose. Specimen containers. Examination gloves. A precision scale of the kind used for weighing biological samples. He thought nothing of it at the time. He was 22, and he'd been told to do a job. "I've thought about what was on that shelf more times than I can count over the years," he told Reyes, nearly 40 years later. The gloves were small. Smaller than any I'd ever inventoried before. Small gloves in a locked cabinet, in a restricted wing, emptied out right after whatever happened. Here is the detail that matters most. Neither Finch nor the unnamed nursing aide had any knowledge of Eleanor's account before Reyes spoke to them. He was meticulous about that, interviewing each of them separately, withholding the other's details entirely, specifically to avoid one story quietly shaping another. Their accounts didn't match in every particular, but they rhymed. In the exact way independent memories rhyme when they're describing the same event from different rooms, different angles, different fragments of the same short window of time. Return, for a moment, to the photographs themselves. Not the ones we have, because we have none, but the ones Eleanor described in that single recorded conversation. 20 frames. Wide first, then closer. The chest of the nearer figure, no visible breath. The hands, that faint banding pattern along the fingers that she noticed only because her entire career had trained her to notice exactly that kind of detail on exactly that kind of surface. I find it difficult to file those specifics under imagination. Not because I'm uncritical, because after years spent reading eyewitness testimony, cross-referencing accounts, sitting with recordings like this one, you start to recognize the difference between a story someone has built and a memory someone has simply carried, badly, for a very long time. The banding on the fingers, the smell like a battery. The single word professional used to describe how she felt in a room that should have made professionalism impossible. These are not the textures of invention. They're the textures of experience. And the photographs, if they existed, if they ever really existed, would have settled the argument entirely. 20 frames of silver and light pointed at something real, in a real room, on a real morning in July. The photographs are gone. The camera is gone. The case file points to a facility that says it was never sent there. And the 8th roll of film simply points to nothing at all. Daniel Reyes died in 1993 at 69. The filing cabinets that reached the ceiling of his converted spare room were scattered after his passing. Some went to colleagues, and according to his sister, several boxes were collected within 2 weeks of his death by people she described only, carefully, as official looking. His original research notes, the ones containing Eleanor's full account, transcribed in his own careful hand, survived today only because Reyes had quietly sent photocopies to a dozen other researchers over the years. He seemed, in hindsight, to have understood exactly how vulnerable the original copy was. Eleanor Voss died 2 years later, in 1995, at 74. She never gave another interview after that one recorded conversation. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't approach a journalist, then or ever. She lived out her remaining years in a small house outside Flagstaff, tended a garden her neighbors would later describe as meticulous, and attended the same church every Sunday for nearly 3 decades. She took her 20 photographs with her, in the sense that the photographs are gone, and she is gone. And what she saw in that room now exists for us only through the record one careful archivist made in a spare bedroom on a telephone call 33 years after the fact. This is the architecture of the thing. Not necessarily a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Something quieter than that, and possibly more durable. A system where information doesn't need to be destroyed outright. It only needs files that move, people who eventually die, copies that circulate while originals disappear, accounts that can never be fully confirmed and never quite fully dismissed either. In the end, the silence is the loudest part of the whole story. I keep returning to a single image, not a photograph, because we don't have one. An image assembled instead from a recorded phone call, a supply corporal's memory of small gloves in an empty cabinet, and a nursing aide who was told, very plainly, not to go wandering. A woman stands in a cold room that smells faintly like a battery. 2 small figures rest on gurneys. A camera has been left for her, by accident, by design, or by someone who couldn't quite bring themselves to remove the last chance at evidence before she arrived. She moves around the nearer figure with the same calm she'd bring to any procedure. She frames. She focuses. She presses the shutter 20 times. And for, however briefly, in the chemistry of silver and light, those images existed. What did Eleanor Voss actually see in that room on the 9th of July, 1952? What did those 20 frames capture that she never quite found the words for, even 33 years later, sitting across from the one person who finally asked? What is the 8th roll of film actually a record of, and who decided, somewhere up a chain of command none of us will ever see, that it shouldn't exist? How many other nurses, orderlies, and supply clerks saw some version of what Eleanor saw and carried it quietly into gardens and church pews and small houses at the edges of small towns, right up until the day they died? What does it mean that the camera was already in the room, waiting for her, before she'd even been told what she was walking into? What does it mean that no one, that day, asked her to sign anything at all? And what does it mean? What does it really mean? That the deepest surviving record of what may be one of the most significant encounters in modern memory is a set of photocopied notes written by hand in a converted spare bedroom, mailed out to a dozen strangers on the quiet chance that at least one copy would survive long enough for someone, eventually, to read it. I don't know what Eleanor Voss photographed in Building 9 on that July morning. But I've learned to recognize what it means when the answer to a question is an absence shaped exactly like an answer. The room is still locked. And somewhere, in a drawer no one alive will admit to opening, the film is still waiting to be developed. This has been a work of fiction inspired by decades of UFO folklore. No real person, tape, or event depicted here is factual.